Hello and welcome to Chess Goblin. In this video, I will show you 3 games played between former world champion Magnus Carlsen and Grandmaster Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. These 3 games are played in the Chess.com Classic, and the winner of these games, who scores 2.5 points first, moves on to the next round. For this first game, Magnus Carlsen starts with the white pieces, and he opens up his game with knight to f3, a sort of ready opening here with a future ideas of pushing maybe the pawn to e3 or g3 here. Next off, Maxime pushes his d-pawn to d5. Magnus pushes his e-pawn with a future idea of maybe also pushing the c-pawn to undermine the d-pawn in the center. And then he pushes his knight, pushes this pawn, captures, recaptures, and he's pushing his pawn here to kind of break up this bishop's diagonal. And pretty basic chess right here. Castles, then we see a pawn push, queen out, and pretty basic stuff here. Then we see this attack in the center, a trade-off, a lot of pieces here, and it's pretty even game so far. We just see regular development of pieces, a castle, pushing up his rook, and then we see this pawn attack here, trying to get some action going, create this into a more aggressive game. And Magnus just pulls back his bishop. Maxime pushes the pawn farther. And then we see this pawn push here, opening up the center, temporarily sacrificing his knight on c3, but creating an attack against Maxime's bishop here, and then we'll open up an attack with a rook against his queen. Here, a recapture with a pawn. And then the brilliant sacrifice, knight captures on d5. And why this is a brilliant move is because after we see capture of pieces here, the bishop, you cannot capture it right away because the queen is protecting it, but it will eventually fall after Magnus slides his queen over, putting more pressure on it. Queen has to move away from that, and then you just pick it up. And it's pretty even here, and we see some trade-off of the rooks, slide his queen over, and now we see Maxime put his bishop on the diagonal, attacking this pawn and Magnus's rook, and if it's already protected by the queen, but if he tries to protect it by sliding, say, his rook over, then his pawn on the a4 square is hanging. And in this position, it looks like black, and it is, according to the computer, has a slight advantage over Magnus here. He pushes this pawn, and the computer says that this is a mistake. It would have preferred a move such as like rook to d1 to maybe trade off these rooks here, and you are hanging this pawn, but this is what a computer would prefer. Instead, Magnus, fearing about the hanging pawn, pushes it forward. And Maxime then attacks Magnus's queen. He has to protect it by moving over his bishop to block it. And now Maxime starts attacking here on against Magnus's king here. And although this pawn looks free here, if, for example, Magnus takes this pawn, then he hangs this pawn here, and now it's 2 pawns on 1 on this side of the board, on the queen side of the board over here, and this is a very scary position and is very hard to defend here for white. So instead of taking the pawn, Magnus slides his rook over, not wanting to get this pawn undefended by moving his queen, but Maxime just pushes his pawn further, and now we see Magnus's king getting opened up. But now he made a mistake by pushing this bishop over, and his pawn seems like it's almost hanging there. And this is the move that the computer wants, to attack this bishop, temporarily sacrificing this pawn, and he cannot ever take this bishop because of the rook attacking the queen. A lot of pins going in this game on all sides of the board. And here he recaptures the pawn, and now Magnus is up a pawn in this position. And he captures the bishop, recaptures the pawn. And now this is a very good move for Maxime here. Not only does it attack this pawn, which is pinned to Magnus's king, it also attacks this vulnerable hanging rook, and then also this pawn here, attacking 3 pieces here at once. And Magnus finds the move, attacking the queen. For example, if Magnus wanted to pull this pawn rook back to protect this pawn, he loses his pawn over on the a5 square. It's just bad in all directions. Magnus finds the best move, moving it here. But he loses the pawn, and then he brings the king in to protect. And now just more attacks. Now threatening this pawn on h2 with his queen. Maxime is slowly creating an advantage over Magnus here. Magnus pushes the pawn, so it's protected by the rook. The computer, anyway, just wants you to attack here. And this would have been the winning idea for Maxime to get the advantage over Magnus. Instead, he doesn't find it, and he just pushes the pawn on the other side of the board. He still has a winning position here, a winning advantage, but the computer still wants you to find this move to h2 here. Magnus pushes his pawn, and now Maxime is slowly losing his advantage here. He's trying to then attack this pawn, worried about this pawn push. Magnus defends it, but the computer, Maxime checks Magnus's king, but the computer still prefers the attack here, because then after Magnus has to move his queen, or king, we see the trade of queens, and then he loses his pawn on this side of the board. And in this position, Maxime is up a pawn, and it's a pass pawn on the edge file. This will be very, very hard for Magnus to stop, and then as he's focusing on this pawn, Maxime can swipe off the king side of the board here, and it would be completely winning here. But instead, he doesn't find it, and instead he just checks Magnus's king. Magnus slides his king over, and now his advantage is really slipping away from him. His winning advantages are falling, and they're just maneuvering their pieces around. Attacks the queen. And now he starts to see more advantages here. Now Magnus's king is pushed to the back row. But now he misses it again. Maxime misses another move. Instead, what a computer would want you to do here is more of a move, maybe rook to h2. And then also threatening mate down here would have been better ideas. But instead, he slides his queen over here, or his rook over here. We see a check. Maxime dodging his king. Another check. And now he's slowly working his way toward the pawn, and to later push these pawns on this side of the board. And now we see another mistake from Magnus. And now Maxime has winning ideas all over again. It likes moves like rook e2, threatening mate again with the queen on f1. And then also attacking this pawn, vulnerable pawn here. But instead, he finds a decent move still threatening mate. Not the best move. But Magnus still lets it happen. If a move such as queen c5 it actually prefers. Because when you go here, Magnus now can defend it with the rook. And although it's still winning, it's not the best option. But Maxime finds it. And now, according to the computer, Maxime is up 6.5 points over Magnus. After he checks Magnus's king, he just slides over, and the winning idea would be queen c3. 7.5 points advantage. It's threatening so many different attacks here. It's threatening this pawn here. It's threatening checks like here. That'd be a checkmate. It's threatening pushing this rook down here and then bringing this queen over here. It's threatening so many things if he moved his queen to c3. But instead, after he moves his king over, he checks the king in the wrong spot. He moves over here and is losing his advantage. He had a complete winning advantage. He's still completely winning, but it could have been done way quicker. He pushes his pawn. Magnus checks his king. And now he's lost complete advantage. It's an equal game here. Maxime at a 7.5 point advantage. Mate was in sight. And now he has lost his advantage. Magnus finds the move. He checks, but it's too late at this point. But now the advantage is back. Maxime now is winning in this position. He's creating winning advantages. He finds the move, pushing his pawn. Gonna maybe promote to a queen by pushing his pawn down here. Magnus slides his king over. And then Maxime blunders. This pawn push here is a blunder because queen h3, which Magnus does not miss. He found it. And loses his rook. Just straight up blundered his rook. He had so many winning advantages throughout this game, but they've all slipped through his hands, and he lost his rook. And they played on a couple more moves, but it's inevitable. It's just a complete winning endgame for Magnus, and then Maxime resigns here. And for the first game of this match between Maxime and Magnus, Magnus is now up by 1 point. And now we head into the second game. And now here, for the second game, Magnus has the black pieces, and Maxime has the white pieces. Magnus is up 1 point. But Maxime now is in the driver's seat, and he opens with e4. Magnus goes e5, and it just opens into a Roy Lopez here. Castle, and then we see this interesting line, taking his pawn. Although it looks free here. This is in the Berlin opening, and this pawn is never really free because there are many lines, such as moving the rook over. Now when you have to avoid the knight by moving him back, they can always capture back here, and the pawn, you lose your pawn then. But he does capture this pawn. Maxime pushes his pawn, Magnus pulls his knight back, trade off of knights and bishops there. Now we see trade-off of queens. Maxime's king is castled and sitting safely here in the corner. But Magnus can no longer castle, and his king is in the middle of his board. Then we see Maxime push his pawn. Magnus pushed the pawn. And then we see Magnus trying to slide his king over. Often in the Berlin, you want to push these pawns up a little bit and create a little safe haven here for your king to hide. As we see Magnus doing here, he opens up this bishop. And in this position, Maxime is winning, and Magnus is very cramped. His king is kind of uncomfortable here. His rooks are both sitting in the corner, and both of his bishops are on very poor diagonals. Now we see him hopping his knight. Magnus trying to open up some lines over here to maybe set his bishop here, maybe blow up this pawn here. And Maxime is just locking it down. Here, Magnus offers a knight trade, because if they trade off knights, it really opens up the position for Magnus and is great here. Magnus can never really take this knight, because then it just pushes this pawn, though, and then his bishop's even in worse trouble. And Maxime doesn't fumble. He doesn't take the knight. He just keeps adding pressure to Magnus. And now we see Magnus building his little fortress here to hide his king. Maxime's now attacking on the king's side, such as he did in the last game. Magnus pushes his pawn, trying to kick away the knight. And the best move here would be if Maxime moved his knight to d2 to later reroute it to the center of the board, and it's got much better squares here. But instead, Maxime puts it in the corner. And here, his knight is now very stuck. He can eventually reroute it over here or push this pawn and get it out, but it's a slower moving for his knight for the rest of the game. And now the game has equalized. Although Maxime looks like he has a lot more free space, the computer says it's equal. Magnus locks his knight in. Now Maxime is attacking here, pushing his pawns. And now this is going to be... Now Magnus has taken his pawn. Magnus is up a pawn here. Although he's cramped, he's materially up. You see Maxime push his knight out. Now he's freed up his knight. His king slide over. His rook slide over for a future pawn push. You see him trade off the knights. This knight that Maxime had was rerouted a lot just to get traded off. But it gets traded off, and then he pushes this pawn. And although it says it's a mistake here, this is a very tricky move for someone to find. What Magnus needed to find here is he can take this pawn here. Although his rook is hanging. And now with the knight is hanging here, you take it. The rook comes down. Then you find bishop here. And now this pawn is impossible for white to protect, and Magnus would have the advantage. But that is a very difficult move for black to find, and very uncomfortable, hanging your rook, just letting him go. Instead, Magnus unfortunately does not find it. Even Magnus misses moves. He moved his rook here, protecting his rook. But now, Maxime pushes his pawn, attacking Magnus's bishop. Now his bishop is lost. If he moves his bishop, for example, to g7, then he hangs it here. And if, for example, he takes this pawn, he loses it here to the knight. So what Magnus does is he trades his bishop for the pawn, loses that, and attacks with the bishop. This was the right idea, moving this bishop up here, but the wrong arrangement of moves to get there. Now, Maxime messes it up. He should have, instead, here, Maxime should have sacrificed the bishop, sacrificed the rook, on d1, and instead add more pressure here, locking up the position for Magnus, and just keep applying more pressure to his king. And then if Magnus takes his rook, now he's got all the files here. He's got the open file, and all his pawns are still intact. But instead, he attacks Magnus' bishop, and now his pawns start falling. He pushes his pawn over on the king's side. Magnus reroutes his rook. He attacks it. But now Magnus is in the driver's seat. Magnus now has the open file with his rook here, and the bishop to pick up these pawns. And then we see a couple more moves, and now one of his pawns have fallen. Now Magnus is up a piece. Although it says materially equal, it is a very difficult position to look at. Magnus is down a piece. He's down a full knight. But he is up 4 pawns. If we keep looking at these moves, now we see a rook trade. And now he's going to pick up this last pawn. Maxime gets greedy here and takes this pawn. What he should have done instead is bring his rook down, slowly adding pressure to take this pawn. But he gets greedy and just takes this pawn. And the issue with this move is Magnus can sack his rook. But now he took 2 pieces for the price of 1. He took the bishop and the knight for his rook. And he will later pick up this pawn here with his bishop. Such as we see here. And now, although Maxime has a rook for a bishop, often bishops, especially with this many pawns on the board still, bishops can be just as powerful, if not more powerful, than a rook. Magnus is up 3 pawns. This is going to be a very tricky position for Maxime to even draw. And instead, he's attacking the pawns, and his start falling on the other side of the board. And Magnus is pushing his pawns, and now has the pawn on the 7th rank, almost to queen here. It's protected by the bishop. It's locked in. And Maxime is in danger here. His rook has to stay on this file to prevent this pawn from queening. But Magnus's king will be faster in this position. He'll run around to help this pawn. And he's got stronger pawns on the other side of the board than Maxime has here. Maxime tries to bring his king into action, needs more pieces to be involved. But now he's getting attacked on all sides. He brings his king over. Magnus brings his king over. See a check, and then Maxime resigns here. And the reason for that is he can push these pawns over on the, what can Maxime do here? Because he has to keep this pawn in this file, so this A pawn doesn't queen. But then he starts pushing these pawns over here, and now he would have 2 pawns about ready to queen on both sides, and Maxime just cannot stop them both. And now Magnus is up 2-0. First person to 2.5 points wins the match, moves on to the next round. So now Maxime has to win these next 2 games. For this last game, Magnus has the white pieces. Maxime must win with these black pieces. If it is a draw, Magnus moves on to the next round. And he opens with d4. And Maxime opens with a Dutch. And here trying to create some advantages, trying to create some aggressive advantages, not wanting to go into something drawish like a Queen's Pawn or a London. And instead, and this is how it goes. Just slowly pushing the pieces. Castle. And now we see this move, c5. And this move may seem a little awkward, but this is a very common move in these Dutch defense openings. And the idea of this is, if black takes here, you can always recapture back and offer a queen trade, and it's going to be a drawish position for white here, which is completely fine for Magnus. And then all these pieces, if we see a queen trade here, all these pieces over here on the queen side of the board for Maxime are all sleeping. They are going to be very struggling with this bishop pinning down, this knight later hopping in. It can hop, and it's going to be a struggle for Maxime to hold off to get a win. It's hard to get winning advantages in that position. So instead, he doesn't take the pawn, but just pushes this pawn on the other side of the board. Magnus checks his king with his bishop, slides it over, opens a square for this bishop to hide in case you ever get this pawn push here. Maxime now developing his knight. Several pieces now. So many pieces are moved now with not a single piece taken off the board. We see castle. And now Maxime hopping into his knight. We see a trade-off of pawns. He pulls his bishop back. Maxime slides his queen over. And then we see this knight hop in. And the problem with this slide over queen right here, why chess.com said it was a mistake, is because of this knight hop. It actually says even stronger move is trading off knights here. But Magnus instead pushes this knight up here, threatening a fork on this pawn, forking Maxime's queen and rook. So he protects it back, and now he's just wasted a move, moving his queen back and forth. So now Magnus pushes his rook over, creating more threats down on the c-file toward this pawn. Maxime tries to defend his knight, defending this file with his bishop. And now Magnus is just shoving these pawns forward. See this knight hop back. And now we see this knight hop in to h4. And the idea of this move is now if Maxime, for example, tries to trade off knights here, Magnus always has this forking idea, hitting the king, and now he would have to move probably there. It doesn't matter where he moved. If he moved there, then he can take this and get some initiative. And then he still picks up the rook. So if he moves there, we see a check, and we just see the rest of Maxime's pieces falling. So now he can't take the knight. And instead, he pushes his king up to try to protect this pawn. And Magnus shows this brilliant move, sacrificing his knight on c7. And the idea of this move is Maxime can never take this knight, because now Magnus can sacrifice his bishop. And after we see a recapture, now he loses his queen. This brilliant move, this brilliant tactic, Magnus found sacrificing his knight. So instead, Maxime just moves his rook over. Magnus reroutes his knight, forcing a trade-off, otherwise he will lose a rook. Then we see many pieces trade off the board, and Magnus is up a pawn in this position with some strong attacking ideas. Pushes his pawn, now forcing a queen trade-off. Because forcing a queen trade-off. And now Magnus has infiltrated Maxime's position here. Both of his bishops far into Maxime's territory, far into the black territory. And this knight also attacking here. And there's no apparent weaknesses in Magnus's position here. Maxime slides his rook over to try to attack the bishop. He just slides it back. Then he tries to hop his knight over. But it just keeps getting attacked. And his position is just slowly crumbling. He moves his knight. He attacks his rook. Magnus attacks Maxime's rook. He has to move it. And in this position, Magnus moves his bishop to c8, threatening this rook, and then also threatening this pawn, which is protected by the knight, attacking the king, and Maxime just resigns in this position. This position will just slowly keep crumbling. If you move something like there, then we can see this bishop capture. The king would have to move. Then we can see a knight hop in, and everything is just falling apart for black. There's no great attacking advantages. There's no great attacking even ideas for black. Maxime resigns. And Magnus goes 3 for 3, not losing a single game against Maxime, and moves on to the next round. 3 impressive games by Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen. If you have enjoyed this video, please hit the like button down below. It really helps. And subscribe if you have not already done before. I hope to see you in the next video.